Native American architecture is important because as a professor of architectural history in the United States, this is a topic that one would sort of think would be taught in our schools of architecture. Actually, it's almost not taught at all unless you go to certain institutions, maybe in the Southwest, where you have living or much more contemporaneous examples of Native American architecture. So I do hope that Native American architecture is something that can be embraced more fully by the architectural schools. And part of the research is to sort of make the archaeological and anthropological research a bit more accessible than it normally has. Archaeologists are great. They'll go to a site and they'll dig it up and uncover something, and then they'll publish a paper in some archaeological journal, and it has no context at all. The drawings are very particular. They'll say what's in a trench, and that the trench faces northeast, but they won't tell you it's located on top of a ridge or at the bottom of a valley or anything like that, right? So what I wanted to do is sort of contextualize the archaeological work in the same way that anthropology has done fantastic interviews with Native American tribes people, but how to put these two things together, this is a bit of still an awkward sort of contact between these two disciplines. So I think what architecture can help us do is sort of to start from the architectural project, the space, the sacred landscapes, the types of building materials, the type of rituals that go into making architecture, to see how architecture is, in some sense, the mediation between these sort of archaeological work and the anthropological work. And since we're dealing with architecture, hopefully architecture can sort of play the role in that. Native American society is also vastly stratified. So we get the Plains Indians, who produce a brilliant architecture that is mobile. You can build a teepee, you can take the whole thing apart, put it on the back of a horse, go 100 miles, and in 25 minutes rebuild the whole thing before a snowstorm and get inside, and it's the warmest place and the best place you'll want to be. Far better than any sort of called modern building where you're going to have heating and God knows what. But it means you might be crunched together in a teepee, but you know, these are still sort of fabulous interventions and innovations. And the teepee, for example, is I'm pretty sure it was invented by a woman, because the teepees are owned by the women. The men go out hunting, and it's the women who construct the teepee, build the teepee, and are responsible for its maintenance. So when they dismount it, they're the ones who have to then do the work of dismounting it, carrying it, and then building it all together again. So these are, you know, amazing architectures. So you have architecture that is meant to be very mobile. Then if you go to South America, you have, of course, fantastic urban civilizations with the Mayans and the Incas with their amazing stonework that still today defies imagination of how actually they were built. We don't know how the Incas made their stonework. They're so exquisite, so beautiful, that today people are thinking that these are made by space aliens, which is insane and an insult to the genius of this civilization. But it just goes to show that we have a whole range of innovations that were made by the Native Americans that continuously sort of excite us and need a lot more research even to understand how these things came about, as well as their historical resonance through time. Well, a great example that I find for me, for almost personally, that when I began to research this, that I sort of said, aha, this is really one of the great reasons why architectural history can play a great role in how we understand the history of Native Americans itself. So 4000 BC, so this is when you had Ur and the Sumerians starting in Iraq and the steppe and the deserts of Iran, and sort of the civilizations going there. At the same time, we find a culture that has only recently been worked on in the Mississippi Valley in Louisiana. They're building these mounds. These are huge mounds, 100 meters across, dozens of meters high. And at first, no one knew what they thought they were natural landscapes. Then it was sort of discovered that they were not natural, but built by man and by hand. So by people carrying dirt on their shoulders from maybe hundreds of miles away to build the sacred mound. The one in archaeological site called Poverty Point is in the shape of a giant bird, which clearly has sort of shamanistic sort of qualities. And first they did imagine a football field size circle, so a 100-meter circle which they first covered in white sand, right? So 1 inch or 2 inches of white sand that they brought from the coast, right, where you can have this pure white sand. And then on top of that, they build a mound with different colors: red soil, orange, red, orange, sort of orangey soil, black soil, white soil, different colors. We don't know what they meant, but they probably were meant for different tribes, had different colors associated with them, like a football team almost, right? And they would come and bring the soil from their regions to build this mound over the period. We don't even know if it took years or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years to build. We don't have no idea. But it's a tremendous accomplishment. So it's clearly building a sacred landscape. And this 4000 BC, long before the Olmecs, who started their mounds in 800 BC. So we're talking almost 3,500 or 4,000 years before. So the tradition of these sort of sacred geographies and sacred mounds starts in the Mississippi region. Now, the problem is that it's a swamp, it's a forest. So these mounds are all overgrown. And as we cut them back, we discover the mounds more and more, and we really only after World War II have started to research these things. And it's really only recently that we've sort of put sort of new thinking about these things and how they relate. For example, how did mound building start in the lower Mississippi? How did it get to Mexico? You know, well, obviously people brought the idea. Mexico, they didn't build mounds out of dirt. They built mounds then out of, well, the first ones were out of dirt, and then they began to build them out of stone, which of course lasts longer if you're dealing with a rainforest situation where it rains and the dirt mound is going to erode. So their drift towards stone was a way solution to keep the mounds from sort of eroding every time it rained. But as a consequence of stone masonry, you need other sort of civilizational devices. Stone masonry is a very difficult and complicated thing, very different from carrying dirt. And this changed this sort of civilizational footprint of the Mayans and then later the Incas, right, who became masters in stone architecture. But its origins was not in stone. The origins was in mud, right, in these sort of sacred mountains. So you have these long continuities, even though the materials change, even though, of course, the sites change and the cultures change. The Incas and the Mayans were corn producers. These early 4,000 people in 4,000 didn't produce corn. They had no agriculture. They were hunter-gatherers living in the forest, right? So we're dealing with sort of different, normally we would think of different sort of levels of civilization, right? Agriculture, Incas and Mayans, no agriculture before. But when we look at the architecture, we see that there are these strong continuities between these two worldviews. When I began to work on this topic over the last decade, what I was always amazed by was when the scholars would say, you know, we only know maybe 10% at best, right? And we're thinking the Mayans, you know, this is a famous civilization, and you're telling me we only know 10% of this? And we have to remember, we as historians are working with still a very small level of evidence. Hopefully 100 years from now, we'll know a lot more. And even if you think on the last 100 years, how we've changed our ideas about Native American architecture, about archaeology, about how buildings were used and designed, we're still really at the beginning of much of this research. But that doesn't mean we have to wait around for 100 years before we do our history. So we want to keep our history up to date with the latest ideas. That's for sure, and that's what I'm continuously trying to sort of develop. But we always have to remember that if you think of what we know about Chartres Cathedral or the French Gothic, I would say maybe we know 90%. I mean, we know all the buildings, 100% of the buildings, and we can continuously research the documents and find a better, more complicated story. But if you want to study the Native American world, archaeologically, we're maybe 10%, 5% of the sites that we could look at. And if we don't have enough of the pieces, it's hard to find the glue and find the answers to many of the questions we want. But for that reason, we shouldn't sort of not talk about it. We still have to make conjectures about how those things operated. We do know a lot, and anthropology in the last, I would say, 10 or 15 years has made huge strides in understanding and reconceptualizing how spaces were used, how shamanism interacted throughout the different places, and the different power relations and different notions of center and periphery, and different ecologies that were at play at the time. So the Mexicans, the Mayans, for example, they loved turquoise. because they made masks out of turquoise and objects out of turquoise. Well, turquoise came from the Americas, from what's in the United States now in the Southwest. Those were the turquoise mines were there. So they had to have what we would call international trade relations with the people up in Arizona to get the turquoise. And so what was exchanged back and forth? We're just now starting to think about, was it salt? Was it baskets? Was it pottery? What were the exchange mechanisms that drove that? So if we want to look at a place like Pueblo Bonito, which is this amazing ritual landscape in the Southwest, we have to understand that it thrived on the turquoise trade with the civilizations in Mexico. So in particular, I would say in the last 20 years, we've become seeing these dynamics in a much more robust way and getting away from the idea of cultures as sort of static places, sort of lost in the forest or lost somewhere in the rain forest or lost in the desert and somewhere sort of isolated by themselves in some way. So there were just as much trade going on then, in some sense, as you could say, as we would expect there to be trade today. Today, our trade is huge. It's an important. No one would dispute that trade is an important part of global reality. You go back to 1200 BC, but trade was important then too, and it conditioned the certain economics of first societies just as much as today. So there's a lot to be learned still, and archaeologically we're still just only sort of scratch the surface really of this world. And many every day new discoveries you hear. On BBC they found the oldest this or the first that, or God, they did this 10,000 years earlier than we thought. And I'm not surprised. Human civilization is much more richer and more developed than we would expect. Unless you really start getting to work in it, you realize that's the truth, right? If you have old-fashioned ideas that we're the civilized and this is the primitive, and then you have very limited ambitions about what it is, what the society would be 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, right? So now they said, the first hut, we can find the first hut 200,000 years ago. Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, where did people live? I mean, of course they built huts, 200,000 years ago.